Welcome, everyone. I'm Michaela Kalowski, and it's my great pleasure to be in conversation today for this Brisbane Writers Festival event with Robert Jones Jr. about his book, The Prophets. I want to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm broadcasting on today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the land where the Brisbane Writers Festival is on, the Yugara and the Turrbal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Before we start, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about Robert Jones Jr. He's a writer, a thinker, and a creative force from New York City. His debut novel that we'll be talking about a lot in this conversation is called The Prophets. He received his BFA in creative writing and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He's written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, and the Paris Review. He's the creator and curator of the social justice social media community Son of Baldwin, a place for discussions of race, sexuality, gender, and disability, which now has over 275,000 members across its platforms. The Prophets is an incredibly beautiful and powerful work of literature. It's a story of love, of the extraordinary cruelty and violence humans can do to one another, and that has been done to Africans and African Americans under slavery. It's a deep peer into the soul of a country and of a place. It infuses magic, myth, memory, continuity with the past, and movingly crafted depictions of relationships and friendships between people who were slaves on a plantation in the South before the Civil War. It's also a book that goes way beyond the story it tells. It's a clarion call. It's a wake-up call. It's a call to power. And it holds up a mirror to America's past and present in ways that are unforgettable. Robert, welcome to Brisbane Writers Festival.
Michaela, thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored.
I wanted to ask, because there are some people who have read The Prophets and some people who may be picking it up, if you could be the person to give us a kind of a synopsis of the place in which the story takes place and the characters who inhabit the world.
Yes, thank you so much. First, I would also like to give a land acknowledgement to the Canarsie and Lenape people on whose land I live, as well as to my ancestors who sacrificed so that I might be here. And a special thought and prayer goes to Micaiah Bryant, a young girl who was recently killed by police. But to get to The Prophets, The Prophets is a story about Samuel and Isaiah, two enslaved young men who live on a plantation in Mississippi during the antebellum slavery period in the United States. What makes Samuel and Isaiah somewhat special is that they are in love. And it is that love that is the catalyst for all movement in the book. Whether it is a positive movement or for some a negative, whether that is enslaver or fellow enslaved. And the book also echoes back to an earlier time in the past to give Samuel and Isaiah's love a sort of history that has been either ignored or erased. And so really at the center of the book is their love and how that is a catalyst for so much that goes on in the rest of the novel during that time period.
Thank you. I know you've talked about this before, but before we talk about the book itself, I think it's powerful and necessary for people to hear and understand where the idea came from for you for this book.
Well, I was in my undergraduate studies. I was near the end of it. As you mentioned before, I received my BFA from Brooklyn College. I was a creative writing major, and I was minoring in Africana studies, the studies of Africana culture, literature, arts, and such. And reading through all of these amazing works by these Black luminaries, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, so many others, what struck me as odd was that there was no mention of the Black queer figure anywhere prior to the Harlem Renaissance, other than in very clinical ways or in ways that were in the context of rape or sexual assault. But my question was, well, what about love? Because I saw no imaginings of Black queer love in the canon at that point. And I think that was in like 2005, 2006. And so when I was entering my first year of MFA program at the same school, Stacy Durasmo, who was my fiction tutorial instructor, gave us an assignment to go out into the world and find objects that a character we're thinking about might possess. And this is how serendipity works, I suppose. I found a pair of shackles in the garbage, just along the pavement. And I said, if this isn't the universe telling me that I should be writing about this particular character and this particular subject, I don't know what is. And because Toni Morrison herself said, if you cannot find the book you wish to read, you must write it. I felt like those two things, Toni Morrison's words and those shackles that I found, gave me permission to tell this story.
At the center of the prophets, as you said, are these two beautiful characters, Samuel and Isaiah, and their love. And it's a deep soul love and a very deep physical connection to one another. There are these fantastic descriptions in the book of how their energy kind of amplifies each other, how they build on each other, their kind of synchronicity. It's a beautiful depiction of love and togetherness as well. Why did you want to write about them? I wondered how soon did they, I know you've just talked about the fact that you know, when you were looking at writing from that time or writing about that time in the antebellum South, there were no depictions of queer love. But I suppose I wonder, how did they come to you to be at the heart of this story?
Well, that when I found those shackles, that to me was a voice speaking in the language that it could speak to me in, to tell me, please witness my testimony and tell this story. And that character eventually became Isaiah. And initially, I was going to own the prophets. The prophets is currently polyphonic. It's told from many different points of view. But initially, it was only going to be told from Isaiah's point of view. And I was going to do something like a fictionalized slave narrative. But I kept running into obstacles in that Isaiah's perspective wasn't broad enough for me to tell the kind of story that I was being led to being told. And so I realized, well, maybe I can give him a partner, someone that he is in love with, who can also share this story with him. And that is how Samuel was born. And I realized then also that even Samuel and Isaiah both speaking wasn't a broad enough perspective. And that's when it dawned on me that it was their love that was the thing that needed to be witnessed. And so it needed as many other eyes on it as possible. And so then Maggie was born, and Paul was born, and all of these other casts of characters, so that the love could be dimensional and given life and body, and seen in a way that was just rich and full. And that is kind of how that the whole cast of characters came to me in that sense.
There are exceptionally beautiful depictions of the women as well. I loved reading about Maggie, who's I suppose she's the kind of the kitchen hand, the cook. She's one of the only African Americans who's allowed into the big house. But also some of the other young women and older women on the plantation, like Pua, who's a young woman who is almost like, you almost see like intergenerational feminism. You know, you've got a Bee Auntie, who's this woman who, for people who haven't read it yet, who's kind of split herself. You know, inside her is a woman who could rebel, and what she's chosen to live with is somebody she's chosen to be someone who will survive on that plantation, and she will survive by aligning herself with men. And then you've got Pua, who's a much younger, you know, very beautiful young woman who will be no one's object, who won't change herself for anyone, which is very dangerous in that place. So these very startling and very modern, you know, descriptions of people. They really felt very alive. And it's a beautiful way that you've just described it, because I wanted to ask you about that choice of having this very, as you say, polyphonic, this beautiful range of characters. But you also write powerfully about Paul and Ruth. You mentioned Paul before, Paul and Ruth, who are the slave owners, and their son Timothy, who has different views, slightly better, marginally better views than his parents, not by much. I wondered what it was like for you to write those characters, to step into those shoes.
I was actually initially not going to write from a white character's point of view at all. But then I realized as I was telling this story that slavery is not the sin of the Black enslaved person. It is the enterprise and the danger and the sin of those who conceived of it and those who kept it working in the American system. And so I thought, well, maybe they need to explain why they chose this enterprise and why they could look at another human being and not see another human being. Please explain to me, not just to the reader, to me, to the other characters, how this could possibly be. And so I felt it terribly important to have their points of view there, whether it's Paul, who is the plantation owner, his wife, Ruth, their son, Timothy, or even Paul's right-hand man, James. And I didn't want it to be a flat description of just wanton evil, but I really wanted to understand from a emotional, from a psychological point of view, how someone could become someone like a Paul or a James. And so I let those characters talk to me and tell me, what made you this way? Why would you do this to another human being? And was fascinated by the answers that were revealing themselves to me. Timothy in particular, I found to be one of the more interesting characters in the book because he is sort of fighting his upbringing with this new education he's been exposed to, and what does that do to him? How does that pull him in one direction or the other? So I did find these things terribly complex and interesting, including Ruth, who is the plantation mistress, who understands the power she has, but also understands how tenuous that power is because she's a woman. So yeah, it was very interesting for me to actually bring those characters in.
I know you mentioned some of those bigger questions about allowing the characters to do that work that you help us do as readers, which is to imagine how people see people in that way. How do you justify seeing a person as utility only, as their value being only, as you say in the book, fuel? And I want to come to that in a moment, but I want to stay with the story a little bit longer. You talk about Ruth and her power or her tenuous power. And I think that another thing that is really extraordinary about the book is that so the plantation in the book is called Empty. That's what the slaves refer to it as, but it's the Elizabeth Plantation in Mississippi. And you detail a lot of different power dynamics between whites, between slaves, between lovers, friends, enemies. And within that as well is I thought there was a lot of commentary, a lot of insight about what happens to the individual when they're under threat. So what will an individual do and what will a group do to survive? Can you talk a little bit about, I suppose, how you came to understand those power dynamics? Were you reading a lot of background and testimony? Was it an imaginative space? Because it felt very real.
I was doing a lot of reading. I was lucky enough to be an Africana Studies minor such that I had so many of these texts immediately available to me, and I had read so many of them already. But I was also reading, and I thank you to Brooklyn College for giving me such a breadth of an education where I wasn't just required to know my major, but I had to take courses like geology and psychology and all of these other courses so that I could have a full education. And so because I had such a broad education, I was exposed to so many different ideas. And one of the things that just kept coming back to me as a golden thread was this idea of power and how it corrupts human beings, irrespective of the identity of the human being who is in power. Whoever seems to have the power seems to think that gives them license. And I began to think of power as this thing where there's a difference between power, which is dominion over other people, and empowerment, which is dominion over oneself. And that distinction is what leads us to either chaos or liberation. And what we see often in the world is power being exercised, dominion over other people, where we feel because we think of ourselves as superior in some way, that we have the right to dictate how other people should live or if other people should live. Whereas I think the more liberatory space is where we're thinking about how we can free ourselves and, as Toni Morrison would say, that makes then our job to free other people. So that is the empowerment that I'm looking for. And it was really great to understand that going into the prophets so that I could explore it in a character like, for example, Amos, who is an enslaved person who ingratiates himself to the plantation owner such that he can protect himself and his family by obviously putting other people in danger. And so that was one of the interesting things about power that I discovered, and that I wanted to make sure that I sort of incorporated into the book. And you see that power dynamic not just with Amos and the other enslaved people, but also with someone like James, who does not have the same power as Paul, but still has power over the enslaved. And so there are these levels to it that are really interesting and complex, but also revealing.
Absolutely. For people who don't know, that James is a cousin of Paul's. He's like literally a poor cousin. He was an orphan child, and he's kind of turned up at the plantation many years before. And as Robert just said, the only power he has that he can exert is over the slaves, and he's very cruel and very unrelenting in that cruelty. There were beautiful sections of the book that were quite different to the rest of it, where the ancestors speak. And I wonder if we could talk about them. There's a kind of they're like a concrete link between the cultural place of beginning of many of the people who've ended up on the plantation, who were stolen from Africa. And these sections where the ancestors are speaking, so there are moments where I feel like they could be speaking to the reader. They could be speaking to the slaves. They could be speaking to themselves. Can you talk about, where those sections kind of emerge from? They are magical and they're very different to the rest of the book.
Yes. The very first inkling of the ancestral voice came to me in a dream. I keep a notepad by my bed because you never know when inspiration strikes. And in this case, it struck at like 2:30 in the morning. And so I woke up in the dark and scribbled something on a pad that I remembered from a dream and went back to sleep. And I usually forget about it because, it's in the middle of a dream. I woke up the next morning, I took my notepad and I came to the computer and I looked at it and it said, "You do not yet know us," in my scribbly script. And I said, that's weird. Let me try to remember what that dream was. And I recalled that someone elder was speaking to me, but I couldn't remember the face. I remember we were in a garden and she was down in the dirt and we were digging for something. And she said, she looked at me and said, "You do not yet know us." And I said, maybe that's the ancestors saying that they need to have a particular kind of voice in this narrative. How do I weave that in such that it feels cohesive and natural to the narrative itself? And so I wrote the first chapter, "You Do Not Yet Know Us."
It's an exceptional first chapter. It's so powerful.
Thank you very much. And then started to sort of weave them in and out and thought, wait, they're not just talking to the reader, because initially that's what I thought. I said, they're talking to me too. And they're also talking to the characters in the book. And so I said, well, where can that lead me? And as I was in the process of writing, what that led me to was the time before in Africa. They led me there. And so now I had these chapters that were taking place in a pre-colonial African society. And I thought, well, this is quite wonderful, the way this kind of came together. And with the help of my editors, Sally Kim, and my agent, PJ Mark, we sort of started to shape it and made sure that the chapters where the ancestors come in sort of came in with a particular rhythm and a particular pacing such that it felt more cohesive. And that was how it came.
Mm. The ancestors, you say, also lead us to that ancient historical, it's not historical, but that ancient experience of the African village where people were taken from. And in the book, you give us a kind of almost like a parallel love story. But one of the things that really struck me about the culture that you describe is that when people, men or women, come of age, they choose who they are. They can be, I think, is it women, men, free or other? Is that right? And
free or all.
Or free or all. And I thought that was just I didn't know if that was a creation of yours or that was actually part of that traditional culture. Can you talk a bit about that? Because that, as you say, the heart of the story is Samuel and Isaiah, and the fact that they love each other. But moreover, the reason that's a problem on Empty is because one of their purposes is to procreate, because they're both so strong and so capable. The idea is that they will in effect be put to stud like farm animals, and they won't give that of themselves. But this parallel from another time spoke to us. It's almost like we're almost reaching that point now where people can say, I may have been born this, but I'm not this, I'm that.
Right. One of the most remarkable things about researching for this novel was discovering the oral histories of Indigenous Africans. So there's an artist activist by the name of Esther Arma, who is from Ghana. And she gave this talk. She was participating on a panel where they were talking about homosexuality on the African continent. And she said, if you had asked my great-grandparents, what is a homosexual? They would have said, I have no idea. We don't have that. And you would have walked away from it as a Westerner thinking, oh, there were no homosexuals in Ghana. She said, but if you had explained to them what you meant by homosexuality, they would have said, oh, you mean love. Because for her tradition, for her tribe, for her village, there was no need to give people designated names for the type of love that they expressed or the type of sex that they had. It was all a part of nature, all a part of the landscape, all a part of their humanity and their village and their culture and their understandings. So that sort of freed me to sort of look at pre-colonial African societies and the ways they thought about gender identity, sexuality. And I found, oh my goodness, so many different Indigenous African societies had so many ways of thinking about these things, ways that we're just now coming to in the West. Like they were thinking about
behind.
Thousands of years ago. We think of them as primitive, but they were so far advanced in terms of their knowledge of humanity. And so one of the things I discovered was the choosing of your identity, gender identity. One of the villages, tribes that I came across, they thought you were all girls at first until such time that you made a different decision. And so that was just incredibly interesting to me. And so I created this village of Kasongo people, which is a fictionalized people. And I drew on all of the things that I found very interesting about the different tribes. And I sort of mashed them into an amalgamation for the purposes of juxtaposing them against how we think about these things in the West. Mm-hmm. And that is how I created those people. I just found all of these things so incredibly fascinating.
They are. And it's also a beautiful counterpoint, but it's a beautiful place to rest. It's kind of like the place we might get to if we keep going,
Indeed.
In the book as well, and I've read other writing of yours where you talk about America's relationship to Black people. But in the book as well, you talk about, I suppose, the deep relationship between white and Black people. And I wondered if you found that. I know you mentioned before Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and other writers who've inspired you your whole life as a person and as a writer. But what it was like to put into words what America's past really is, what America has been founded on, because it's something we're all really coming to understand now or talk about now.
Indeed. The United States is a very interesting case in that, unlike many other modern or Western societies, America refuses to reckon with its past. We are very anxious to get past it. We are always talking about moving forward, but we're never talking about reckoning with what was wrought. In fact, right now, the conservative members of our government are looking to remove from academic institutions any study of race theory or ethnic studies or anything like that. They want it completely removed because they want us to learn about America in the mythological way that we have been learning about it all of this time. They want, the founding fathers and the American flag and apple pie and, those sorts of things, but they don't want to talk about antebellum slavery or the genocide of the indigenous population and so on and so forth. So writing about it in this particular period is not just cathartic, but it is also necessary. Because there is a conscious effort on the part of people with power in this country to pretend that none of these things ever happened, that America is innocent of any accusation, and that people who are marginalized in this country are just complaining about nothing, that they're imagining the pains and the oppression, that we are being gaslit in ways that are manufactured by almost every institution in the country. So I find writing about this to be imperative.
In the context of writing about it as well, can you talk a bit now about Son of Baldwin, the site and I suppose it began as kind of a blog and now it's a community that you created. Why did you create it? And what has it enabled you to explore and learn?
I created Son of Baldwin in about 2007 or 2008 as a tribute to James Baldwin. He was somebody that I came to rather late in my academic career. I didn't realize that he was so brilliant, that he was a Black queer man from New York City, and was this brilliant writer. So all of the things I was and wanted to be. But once I was exposed to him, I devoured everything he ever wrote. I was sad to learn that he passed away in 1987 because I would have loved to meet him and just pick his brain. But I watched a documentary on public access television here, PBS, in New York City. And they had a documentary about James Baldwin. And in that documentary, toward the end of it, his brother said, as James Baldwin lay dying on his deathbed, that James Baldwin said to him, I hope someone finds me in the wreckage. And that so broke my heart. And at the time, which was maybe about 2007, I thought, why aren't we talking about James Baldwin and his work? He was so brilliant. I'm going to start a blog where we celebrate James Baldwin, talk about his work, and also talk about the issues that he brought up, the politics, sexuality, race, gender, all of these things. And so I created Son of Baldwin and didn't think that it would take off. I thought, I'd just get to say, read this book by James Baldwin and let's talk about it, that sort of thing. And then Facebook became a thing. And I put it on Facebook, and through word of mouth, the community just continued to grow and grow and grow. And the value that I find in it is that I get to talk to people all over the world. Black queer people in Brazil, transgender women in Zimbabwe, queer communities in Britain, and learn so much about the different ways in which we think about gender identity, and sexuality in these different cultures. And it's just been an utter education. And that is the best part about this community, is that we learn so much from one another. It's really, truly been an honor.
Mm. There's something that, coming back to the actual prophets as well, that there's a lot in the book about remembering stories and sharing stories, and about what happens when people are broken from their stories. And I wondered if books like The Prophets or communities like Son of Baldwin help to restore some of that cultural connection and that knowledge, or that empathy. Not that empathy in and of itself is enough.
It's really difficult in any public space, but in particular, social media, which I call the digital Roman Colosseum.
Fantastic.
In that it is, it can often be a really cruel space.
And a reductive space as well.
And a reductive space as well, because it does tend to lack nuance when we're having these discussions. But I think to be able to at least broach these subjects, to put them out there such that people who are inclined to do so can go and do their own research and maybe be educated and maybe be led in the direction of humanity and empathy and righteousness and liberation, as opposed to looking at another human being and deciding simply because they are transgender or Black or Indigenous, that they are somehow less than. Maybe we can break maybe one or two people at least out of that mindset, such that Black people have a saying, each one teach one, such that, maybe we start with one person and it grows exponentially. I hope that is the work that the Prophets and Son of Baldwin is doing in the world.
Mm. When we were talking before, and we both talked about how you wanted to explore in some of the white characters in the Prophets, how it is that a person justifies their actions, how a person can justify treating another person as not a human being. And I wondered, it sounds like almost a naive question, but you've sat with this for, you wrote the book over many years. You're talking about the book, you do work in this space. If you've come to any other deeper conclusions about the why, about why people do that, not leaving aside some of the economic arguments, but how humans do that to each other.
It to me, it strikes me as a profound selfishness. It's almost like you never grow out of the infancy of children. When they're babies, they just, all they know is, I need to eat, I need to be entertained, I need my diaper changed. It's almost as though people who practice bigotry are in that eternal state of infancy where they need validation, resources, and they feel threatened by anybody else coming into that space, also receiving those things. And so they have to tell themselves these stories. You're inferior because you're a woman, or you're inferior because you're Black, or something else, because I need to feel as though I'm entitled to whatever it is. And that not just am I entitled, but I'm entitled to do whatever I want to do and remain innocent and good, even though I'm doing something evil and bad. And as I said before, anyone's capable of that.
It's a brilliant section in the book where you say there are no monsters, there are just plain people.
Just plain people. Anybody who has that within them and then has the power to enact it is capable of doing it. And I've seen it firsthand, that anyone is capable of it.
Mm. You've said before that when you were writing this book, you were thinking about or anticipating the opposition that you might receive when it was out in the world. Was that a motivator for you when you were writing it, or did that sometimes get in your way? How did you manage that?
I think it sometimes got in my way, to be honest. I was worried that a particular subset of Black communities who were very conservative would find talking about queerness antithetical to Blackness. I thought also a particular religious segment of Black communities would find it sacrilegious to talk about queerness and also criticize Christianity in some ways. And I thought that the entire project would be seen as somewhat far-fetched, because who would think that Black queer people could have possibly existed during that time period? Because we often think of queerness as a modern invention, as something that just popped up in the 1920s or so. And that Black queer people couldn't have possibly known themselves as queer and loved each other as queer people. And so it was sort of an impediment, because I was afraid of the backlash, but I was also compelled to keep writing about this because these characters kept talking to me. And I felt duty bound to tell this story because it is a story that I had not yet seen told.
What were the experiences you had of Black queerness growing up around you and in your life, in your community?
There was no safe space for me. When I was in white spaces, my race, in addition to my sexuality, was an issue. And then when I was in Black spaces, my sexuality was an issue. So there was almost no safe space, because even when I found Black queer spaces when I was young as a teen, because we were so traumatized and broken, we often took that out on one another, as often oppressed people do, is you internalize the hatred. And so you begin to hate one another and show that hatred in various ways. And so I felt utterly alone. That's part of the reason why I turned to writing, because writing was where I could imagine a place where I belonged, where I could have family and community and love and joy. And so although it's sort of kind of despicable and sad that I did not have a safe space, the benefit of it is that it turned me toward what I feel is my purpose, which is writing.
Mm. You said before that The Prophets is more of a witnessing than a book. What did you mean?
I meant that it felt like I was being told by an ancestor, please write down this story that they had erased from the cultural understanding. Please reinscribe this into the narrative, because no one is telling my story and I existed. I was here. And will you please, in the tradition of Black Christians, will you please witness this testimony? And so that's what it felt like very often, because I told my editor, Sally Kim, this as well. There were some times when I was writing this book that it felt like something else was taking over. That yes, it was me sitting at the keyboard and typing, but it felt like something was flowing in me that was just not me. It was almost like I was watching as my fingers were doing the typing, as someone else was giving me the words to say. And so that is why it felt like a witnessing.
There are these repeated sections we've talked about that the ancestors deliver in the Prophets. And they say, we just need you to do one thing, remember, but memory is not enough. And that becomes a refrain throughout the book. And we've touched on today this idea of finding stories, of restoring stories, of telling stories, of speaking the truth in that way. But what is needed to do then beyond just remembering? How do we make change?
You have to be willing to commit to the action. So it's fine to remember, because memory is important, but now how do you act upon that memory? What do you do to restore? What do you do to make the world a better place than the condition in which you found it? Because that your job is not simply to tell the story. It is to heal the wound. It is to unchain the shackle, because you are now free. Your job, as Toni Morrison said, is to free someone else. There is no such thing, I said the other day on Son of Baldwin, liberation is not a solo endeavor. It is a group effort. It's either we are all free or none of us are free. And so that is the responsibility of every human being on the planet. And you have to remember, because you have to see all the despicable places we've been. And then memory is not enough, because you have to make sure that you do not repeat that. You do better.
Mm. You referred to some fantastic writers who inspired you, who you read while you were studying, but I feel like we're seeing a kind of an evolution of literature on this topic. And I wondered if you could reflect on that a little bit. Do you think that it feels like we're seeing more and more stories, literature about slavery being published in recent years, or has it always been, there's been a steady flow of it, but we just didn't kind of like to focus on it?
There has been...
Think about Colson Whitehead and Marlon James and so many others.
Yes. And recently, there seems to be a sort of push to examine that time period, because there's been for a very long time in Black communities this idea that let's not talk about this. It was so dreadful, so painful, so traumatizing. Let us not talk about this anymore. But I was talking to another writer, Sadiqa Johnson, who wrote Yellow Wife, which is also a book about antebellum slavery. And we both concluded that if there were 20 million slaves, or enslaved people, there are 20 million stories to tell. And that we should not run away from that, because it is not our shame. That these people had lives and loves and understandings, and they made contributions that should be witnessed. And I am sort of glad that people like Colson Whitehead and Marlon James and others, Sadiqa Johnson, are writing about this, because it shows not only that there's no such thing as a slave story, but these stories are so different from one another. They illuminate such different things about that time period that we are, if we are white Americans, sort of afraid to look at because of what it implicates, and who it implicates. And if you're a Black American, the pain that it dredges up. But we have to. The only way we get to heal, to evolve, is by examining that particular time period as well as others. But you are right. There was a time in which there was a dearth of these kinds of stories, and they sort of have experienced a kind of renaissance in the last 20 years, not just in literature, but also cinema.
And plays as well. Yeah.
And plays as well. Yes. Yeah. In fact, Danye R. Love wrote a play in 2018 called Sugar in Our Wounds, which is about two enslaved Black men in love. So I was writing The Prophets as that play came out and thought, oh no, I'm not going to be able to write this book because Danye R. Love wrote this play. But I thought, no, because his story too is different from my story.
That's right. And as you said, there are multiples of multiple stories. And yes, the stories that you describe as well in the lives of the people who survived on Empty are also lives of, extraordinary pain as well. There's a lot in the book about mothers and children, fathers and children, about siblings and losing each other. And I can't help but think that those stories live on in all of us, whether we know them or not. And the other, do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I am lucky enough to be old enough to have been alive when an enslaved person in my family was alive. Wow. I was an infant, of course, so I don't have any conscious memories of this person, but I was alive when they were alive.
Who was that?
And that was my great-great-grandmother, Binky Bethay. That was her name.
Where was she? Where was she enslaved?
She was enslaved in South Carolina. And I used to visit South Carolina as a child. Every summer, my family would go down to South Carolina to visit family and, just get out of the urban environment and into the country environment. And I didn't realize that I was actually playing on the very plantation in which my great-great-grandmother was enslaved. So her eldest daughter, my great aunt Annie, who I did know, built her home with her husband on a parcel of land that her mother's enslaver gave to her when they were freed from slavery. She built her home there. So I was playing on the plantation that my great-great-grandmother Binky was enslaved on, and I had no idea. But there was something in what we call the blood memory, in the silences, in the way my great aunt Annie and her sisters, including my great-grandmother Mary, carried themselves, that made its way into the prophets. When you look at Auntie and Maggie and Sarah and Essie, they are inhabiting the spirits of these elder women in my family. And as a result, I'm learning so much about these women who did not always tell me their stories, but didn't always have to, because there was something about the ways in which they moved that communicated to me without words.
Which is maybe part of what's made you such an exceptional writer as well.
Thank you.
You write in the book about place memory. You describe in passing the generations of desecration and violence that have taken place on that plantation, from the murder and the slaughter and the rounding up of the First Nations people who were on that land, and then to all the slaves who died arriving or working, and that you describe how they just kind of fall into the field and literally become part of the land. Have you had that experience yourself? I mean, you talked about playing on the land where your great-great-grandmother had been enslaved, that sense of place memory.
Yes. One of the things that my mother used to tell me when we went down south was this place is haunted. And it scared me because as a kid, I'm thinking ghosts. And, from horror movies, you think, oh, ghosts are bad or scary. But as an adult, I understand now what she meant by haunted. It's haunted by the spirits of the people who toiled there, who died there, who did not receive satisfaction there, whose land it actually belonged to and it was snatched from them there. That is the haunting she talked about. So as a child, I interpreted it as something scary, but now I have great, great reverence for it. And so, yes, even here in New York City, there are certain places you walk by and something ancient, it feels like something ancient. And it's something that you feel like you should bow to or pray to, or just take a moment and be silent in tribute to. And so I'm very conscious of those things. Yes, indeed.
We've touched on the idea, we talked about it before, this desire in America, as you say, to move forward, that people, especially maybe in your community, don't want to reflect on the years that were terrible, the sad moments. But, it made me think of the fact that we saw that movement in the United States last year after the murder of George Floyd, and it happened around the world, of people tearing down monuments, of people ripping down statues. And I wondered if you could reflect on why it's taken us so long to question the legitimacy of those statues, to question who we build statues to.
Well, I remember being in kindergarten and being told that I had to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And it was just it almost seemed like a natural thing to do. Everyone stood and put their hand on their heart and pledged allegiance to the flag. It is the indoctrination of the country. You're indoctrinated since birth to believe certain things, that America is beautiful. It's a beautiful place that democratizes the world, and that you are lucky to be here, and that America is good. That there are some bad things that happened in the past, and we should forget about that and move forward. And because every institution, including academic ones, are telling you this, you believe it. Your churches are telling you this, your parents are telling you this, so you believe it. And you don't question it until you encounter a different experience, when you are at the mercy of a police officer, or you are minding your business and walking down the street as a woman, and some man feels he has the right to accost you. And then you begin to question the reality that you've been told is real, and say, wait a minute, something is not right here. Why is the world this way? And you begin to research and read and understand that you've been told a lie. Mm-hmm. And so it takes a long time to wake up from that lie. I think of that movie, The Matrix, and how, we're all plugged into that machine, and then someone yanks the cord out, and then you're like, wait a minute, what's happening? And that is where some of us are right now, is where we're at that place where, like, wait a minute, what's happening?
You've got a great description of it in The Prophets, where somebody says it's like, the idea of America being this place of liberty, founded on this idea of liberty, that it's like, but it's really not. It's like Europe without any of the baubles. It's this kind of this very barren, hollowed out idea of what liberty might have been. And I wonder, when we look at both the impact of a work like The Prophets, but also the work and the engagement you do in conversations and in the writing you do on Son of Baldwin, whether there can be reckoning, whether there can be healing and understanding in a country like the United States of America, where the gulf between experience is so great. And whereas you say you're awake, but other people aren't, you say America is anti-Black. It has a real anti-Blackness problem, but there may be as many writers who would disagree with you because they don't see the world the way you do. How do we bridge that to make real change? We opened this conversation by you naming another African-American who'd been shot by police. How do we make those changes real?
Michaela, this is the $1 million question, to which I do not have an answer. Because there are some people who are simply committed to the idea that because I'm Black, because you're a woman, that you are somehow less than. And their entire identity as a human being is built on that understanding. Toni Morrison, I know I quote her so often. She once told a TV host, if you can only be tall because someone is on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And part of the issue is that America doesn't know it has a serious problem. It thinks this is normal. It really, truly believes that this is normal. And so I don't have the answer to how we fix it. I do not have the answer.
The book has been received, The Prophets, so powerfully by people around the world, not only Black people, not only African-American people, in Australia, people all around the world. Do you think that books like The Prophets go some way to shifting how people feel and see and think about other people?
I want to say thank you to the people of Australia, because Australia has been so kind and so generous in terms of me and the Prophets. I have never been so welcomed. The first time that I heard applause for the book was Western Australia's audience. They applauded.
Oh, awesome.
And it made me cry.
We're a good bunch of readers. We really are.
It's just fabulous. But that is my sincerest hope, that which is why the book ends with a chapter called New Covenant, is with the hopes that whoever reads this book walks away with it or moves away from it with a deeper understanding of humanity and why we should be humane to one another and what that means and the work that has to be done in order to achieve that. So I really do hope that the Prophet is doing some of that to change some minds or expose some people to a different way of thinking about us as human beings.
I know that it has, because it's had that effect on me. Robert Jones Jr., thank you so much for being a guest of the Brisbane Writers Festival.
Michaela, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a joy.
Fantastic. And for everyone watching, just a reminder that there will be more online conversations for the Brisbane Writers Festival. So make sure to check their website or their Facebook page. But for now, thank you all for tuning in, and see you soon.